Okay, welcome divas and dudes to the nutrition class for September 5th. It's so great to have you. For anybody that's new out there, I'm Suzanne Ryman, and I am the nutrition coach for the Start Center, as well as my wonderful Thrive Well ladies and gals. And also, I do nutrition coaching. I used to own Powerhouse Bakery, and I'm still doing production on small scale. So if there's something special that you want, spices and flour blends, and even some other goodies, I'd love to share those with you. So just reach out to me. And so today I have a really exciting topic, I think. What I want to have as a takeaway for you is to understand a little bit around what the science is saying about waist circumference and body mass index, and how do those parameters help give us valuable information about what to eat for our healthiest selves. So longevity and, of course, diet are so interrelated, and so we call that mortality, longevity, how long do you live, and then morbidity is what illnesses are you stuck with in your life. And COVID kind of taught us this, that we really can't get healthy at the snap of a finger. We can't necessarily start eating healthy right away, take supplements and zinc and vitamin C and D and fix our problems. So it's really a long-term approach. But even stopping smoking, in a few weeks and months, you see improvements in your lungs. So of course, any changes we make right now are gonna help us. And so what I really want to focus on this morning is, how does our diet impact our fat cells? Because really the newest and latest information that I'm so excited about is that fat cells are a metabolically active organ. They are an organ that has all kinds of jobs. And so as we go through the slides, I want you to keep thinking, no longer are fat cells just hanging around, making our waists feel tight or our hips feel full in our jeans, right? It's a metabolically active tissue. And just a little history, back in the 80s, when I first started teaching fitness and I was such a fan, we were taught that brown fat was the only metabolically active tissue. And that was a small section of fat in our upper back. And it was, from evolution, that it was really a piece of the physiology that helped with thermoregulation, and we all wanted our brown fat because it had mitochondria. Well, now we're finding that we have active white fat, and that's kind of what we're going to focus on today. How crazy is that our fat is metabolically important in our health and wellness? And the other thing I want you to keep in mind as we go through these is our body is always trying to create homeostasis, balance. So I kind of call it yin and yang. We're always trying to figure out how the hormones in our system and those bioregulators work together to keep balance. And so you'll see that these fat cells have good things that they do, and once they get triggered, they can also have bad things that they do. And so that has a lot to do with our longevity, our mortality, and our morbidity. So the fat cells, as they start to get out of hand, out of balance, they start being a monster rather than a helper. And so when we look at our measuring tools, of course that leads into, okay, we understand what's happening with these tools. Now, what are we going to do with that information? So of course it begs the question of diet and exercise, which I know I'm preaching to the choir, because if you're coming to nutrition, you know that it's important. And I know that a lot of you are going to the exercise classes too. And so hopefully this will be just a kind of pat on your back that you're doing a lot of things right. But also maybe some new things to study. So that's what we're going to do at the very end of classes. I'm going to propose that we have a September kind of study of the divas and dudes. I've asked for you to send me recipes, and so you still have all of today, and I'll even gladly take it tomorrow, because I really want you to send me a recipe that's your favorite, because always what I try to do with our classes is give you some valuable information and then narrow it down to action items. What are we going to do with that information? So what I hope is that we'll be able to look at some of your favorite recipes. We're going to do a little study on you guys the first week, so this week coming up, and then we're going to try to implement some of the recommendations that the science is telling us. Okay? All right, so let's get started. Improving body mass index and waist circumference using energy restriction and protein intake. What do I mean by energy restriction? Lowering your intake. So restricting how many calories you can eat is calorie restriction. I almost feel like, we should stop calling it weight loss. We should call it shredding fat. Hey, last month I shredded fat. I mean, why do we say we lost weight as if we wanted to find it again? No, if we lose weight, we never want to find it again, right? So it made me kind of chuckle that when we want to lose weight, something's got to change with our intake. So energy restriction, and then we're going to find that protein intake is probably the most important flag we wave as far as tools that are successful in this whole journey of improving our wellness. So body mass index, what exactly is that? BMI. Has anybody had their BMI evaluated? Yeah? Quite often doctors' offices will do that, especially, in the kids and teens, and, it's kind of one of the protocols. When you go to a doctor, a wellness visit, they do what? They check your weight, they check your blood pressure. Sometimes they'll look at BMI, especially, like I said, younger kids. What we're proposing, we, the, health and wellness industry, is let's add to that. We should be also measuring waist circumference, because that is a really powerful indicator that those fat cells that we now know are very important as metabolically key components to our wellness can turn into monsters. And if we can catch it early by the swelling of the waist circumference, we could maybe act on it sooner. So that's interesting to me. So I thought, well, I better be the guinea pig. And so I did my own BMI calculation. And of course, you can do this on the web. There's all kinds of tables out there, and you look at your height and your weight, and it gives you a number in the middle. But I wanted you to kind of see that there truly is an algorithm that goes along with it. And so you can calculate your very own BMI by using this formula. And so even if you're not a math person, you're basically looking at your weight in pounds. So your BMI is equal to your weight in pounds times this funky number, 703. Don't ask me how they came up with it. It's basically because they've done a lot of research and they put in a kind of an average value, and that's how they come up with that. So your weight times 703, put that number aside, and then you also have to look at your weight in pounds and then your height. And so it gives you kind of a breakdown. Your height in inches times your height in inches. So you do it twice. So I did mine for you, and we got 101, which is my weight, times 703, and then divided by my height, which is 59 inches times itself. So I come up with a BMI of 20.39. Okay, so that's my number. And again, if you don't want to do all the math, just Google BMI, and it'll let you plug in your weight and your height. What information is it missing? My age, my gender. It's not even taken into account where I'm holding my fat, right? It's not taking into account if I'm athletic or not. And so many people go, oh, BMI doesn't matter. It's completely outdated. And the reason why it's outdated is people have gotten so out of range of their body mass index that we feel like we can't possibly meet that. It must be because I have too much muscle, right? That's sometimes what we hear. I'm so muscular that my BMI is way out of whack. Really, it's probably still correct. You know, it's giving us, again, a load of data that we look at over years and years. It was really the insurance companies that started BMI tracking because, of course, it mattered in your morbidity and your mortality if you had this indicator that said, oh, you're high risk because you're, overweight. So anyway, it definitely is a good tool. And okay, if we don't get exactly in the ideal range. We're going to work towards it. And you'll even see as we go through these a couple of surprises. So BMI tells only part of the story, offers poor representation of the details, like I mentioned. If I carry all of my weight in one area of my body, that's going to have some metabolic implications, right? And so lean body mass. What about bone density? If my bones are super light, brittle, my weight is going to be down, and that's an important indicator that I don't want to lose track of. So fat mass, of course, the mortality risk is related to that fat mass. And so what is surprising to me is when we look at the body mass index range, we get a U curve. U curve means that on the ends of that U, there's higher risk. So let's look at that a second. Lower risk in the green zone. So you can see green zone normal is between 18.5 and 24.9. So my example, I fit into that normal range. Okay, good. And interesting, so on the ends, so 18.5 and the extremely obese are those ends. So higher risk, we can kind of get, okay, if you're very obese, yeah, higher risk. But it's kind of surprising that even on the very low body weight, there's a higher risk. And what age group do you think that would be specific for? The elderly. Yeah, because, I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but, they say it's good to have an extra 20 pounds when you're, a certain age range, so that if you are hospitalized or, XYZ happens, you got a little cushion, That's not exactly true. There's no really such thing as healthy overweightness, but there is a point of not being of being too thin. So being too thin can give you a risk as well. So higher risk in the lower than 22 for not elderly, but over 65, and then lower risk for younger adults at 25. So younger people do great at the low end. That U curve is really prominent when we're looking at people that are a little bit older, because we also don't want their bone density to go down, right? And that's all something that we really care about. And when we see a calorie restriction, guess what happens? Bones also decrease. So that's why getting too low in calorie intake can have a negative impact on our bones. So we don't want that to happen. So again, it's always homeostatic. Always, where is that balance, Suzanne? How much do I know is the right amount, And you'll see when we do our little test on us, the baseline that we create in week 1, when you do your calorie counting for us, that's going to be whatever calories you're currently eating that maintain your current weight. Unless you're in weight loss. If you're losing weight and you don't want to be losing weight, well, we for sure need to fix that. But if you're pretty much status quo, and you show me how many calories you're eating and protein, that's going to be really good information. That means that whatever you're doing right now is holding your current weight. And that's a good thing. That's great information to know. And, coming from somebody that isn't a big calorie counter, I do want to say there's some value in it when we're trying to really evaluate where we are with a goal to improve. So if you had a goal, then we got to first know where we are first. So waist circumference, and I alluded to that in my intro, the pathophysiology of visceral obesity. I know that's a mouthful, but let's break it down. The patho, which is bad, the disease physiology of too much fat in the core. We know that there's some really important risk factors, and that's again why waist circumference is probably even more important than body mass index. Body mass index can give us an idea, but even more important is let's measure where our waist is. CAD, what does that stand for? Anybody know? Cardiovascular disease. So coronary artery disease is literal. Hypertension, diabetes type 2, so diabetes mellitus type 2. So how do you think having core fat would affect your coronary artery disease? Doesn't right away make sense, but what happens is those fat cells become a monster and they start causing arteriosclerosis. So it causes the hardening of the arteries. Not so much because the fat is in the lumen of the artery, which that's part of it, But there's a whole separate cascade of events that happens with your fat cells giving off cytokines, these hormone-like substances that are hurting our other cells. So it's so interesting. So what exactly is the metabolic syndrome? That's a syndrome which is kind of means a grouping of symptoms that seem to lead to an outcome. So these group of symptoms are a high waist circumference, high blood pressure, elevated blood sugar, and sometimes elevated blood pressure. So blood pressure, blood sugar, waist circumference, and maybe even overall weight up. And so what exactly is happening in that issue? Well, again, the fat cells are exerting a negative impact on the liver and the pancreas. It's making it harder for the body to process sugar. And so it's kind of like getting a really bad traffic jam on I-10, and nothing can really move because there's too much sugars in the blood. So you have poor metabolism of the sugars. And that's really because the liver and the pancreas are getting clogged up. So interesting. So again, that dysfunctional adipose tissue or fat tissue is what we're really trying to look at. And the pro-inflammation, so those cytokines, that's a funky term for these cells that the fat cells give off that are promoting inflammation. So again, it's all from the way the fat cell grows out of hand. It's no longer homeostatic. So the fat cells communicate. Here's that yin-yang idea that I was kind of describing. Functions like chemical messengers. And again, this is new. I mean, it's not that new, but it's pretty new because for so long we health enthusiasts thought fat was just something that made our genes bulge. But there's really a lot more to it, especially if you have a certain type of fat cell that's growing. So leptin was a really important hormone that was given off by the fat cells. And it was discovered in 1994, which again, not that long ago. In fact, I was on one of the very first teams in San Antonio that studied leptin. And it was super interesting. We basically had a double-blind study. So the investigators and the subjects didn't know what group they were in. Everybody got the same, inducement of medicine. It was an injection actually in your tummy. No fun at all, but they did it. And these, it looked like after about 6 weeks, we could tell what group was getting the leptin because their weight, everybody in this one group went down. It was really clear. All the data merged together. So we're like, oh, you got it. Oh, you didn't. Oh, you got it. You didn't. Just guessing, of course, because we didn't really unblind the study. And then almost like clockwork, at month 3, the numbers went back up. So they stopped losing weight and started to regain it. So as we unblind the study and we learn about the whole situation, we're not quite as smart as the body. The leptin that we were trying to give to control those fat cells, the body acclimated to. And so for a while it worked, and then it didn't. Now, since 1994, there's about, I think, at least 10 other hormone-like substances just like leptin. So I can promise you that the powers that be that are excited about studying fat blasting, not weight loss, fat blasting, are really trying to figure out these cytokines and what exactly are they doing and how can we intervene so that we don't have the morbidity and the mortality that comes along with an expanding waistline. In fact, so often, I worked with a menopause company for a while, and so often docs say, no matter what, once you hit menopause, just plan on gaining 10 pounds, and it's all going to be around your waist. Well, that's a little bit of self-fulfilling prophecy, I'm going to say, but I'm determined to not let that happen. And I truly think that we could avoid that even when we have hormonal changes as we age, because let's face it, hormone changes are happening early on all the way through our lifespan. So yes, it's a pretty significant change for our estrogen levels to decrease, but I'm convinced that we can change with the times and modify our eating to adjust. And again, I'm speaking to the choir, but even moderate fat loss increases that insulin sensitivity, which is a really powerful component. So now let's think back on the metabolic syndrome. Part of that whole syndrome or cascade of events is because the pancreas isn't able to do its job very well. And so it's pumping out the insulin, but not as well. The second part is the muscle cells are also affected by leptin and all these cytokines. The muscle cells aren't able to absorb the sugars as well. So what happens? Your sugars in your blood go up, and that's what causes all these problems. So anytime we can improve insulin sensitivity is a good thing. That prevents core adiposity. So anything we can do that lowers insulin response is a good thing. So keep that in mind. That's a big, red pen on your notes. Now also the cardioprotection by promoting healthy endothelial function. That's good too. That's a lot of mouthful too, but really that's relating to the heart. So when we have healthy myocardial tissue or endothelial tissue, that means that atherosclerosis is pushed aside. The cells are working better. So the mitochondria and the oxygenation of that cell is improved. And then immune modulating. So turning on the immune response by making sure that those healthy fat cells are giving the information, the communication that we want, and it doesn't turn into a monster by getting overblown. So here it is, WAT, the fancy new term, white adipose tissue. And what is it doing to regulate our homeostasis, which I think is so interesting. We got plenty of WAT around, let me tell you. So we want to make sure we harness it and make it do a good job for us. So regulation of energy, hunger, glucose and lipid metabolism. Have you ever noticed, especially maybe even when you went through treatment, but your energy is just really lacking? Now, of course, if you're in cancer treatment, there's a lot of reasons for that. But could also be that if you've had weight loss, sometimes you feel a slump in energy. Or you've been on a long weekend of vacationing and you've eaten really heavy and you have a slump in energy. Both of those sides of the equation could really be some of this fat cell communicating going on. Energy and hunger communication. I love to talk about the hormones in our GI tract that help regulate hunger and satiety. There's ghrelin, which is growl, and that's the hormone that communicates with the fat cells and tells our brain, I'm hungry. Go eat, growl, ghrelin. And so again, the fat cells have a certain size that they want to be. And if we've been using the energy in those fat cells and they start to shrink, then they tell the brain, feed, I'm hungry, so we can get back into normal, that homeostasis. So I don't know if you remember this, but years ago, probably the early 80s, there was a set point diet. Anybody remember that? Probably not. Yes, maybe. The set point diet was understanding a little bit of this idea that our fat cells, maybe genetics, want to be at a certain size. They want to be there. So you lose some weight and you feel really good and you just eat or look at a donut and you gain that weight back. Not really, but it goes so fast, right? Because your fat cells have a memory. They want to go back to that size. So energy and hunger regulation has so much to do with that cell memory. And then it's so important that those fat cells are involved in the regulation of glucose and lipid because, again, the fat cells know that they want to be a certain size. So they're going to open up for more sugars to come in if they want to get fatter, and they're going to absolutely put fatty acids out if they're forced to burn their energy. So functions are thermogenesis. What do I mean by that? Temperature regulation. And so if you are a thin-natured person and you get cold all the time, your WAT communication is reminding your body that you're cold, and you've got to communicate that to your little muscle cells in your skin to shiver and get warm. But the fat cells have so much to do with that communication. Neuroendocrine. So we've talked a little bit about how serotonin and brain chemistry is so related to our metabolism. And so here's another example of that. Reproductive. So if if our fat percentage gets low enough, you might have heard of this, some young female athletes, if their weight gets low enough, they'll stop menstruating. Again, it's the body's way to preserve, because those fat cells say, whoa, I am way too thin. Let's turn off everything we can, so reproduction is affected. And that's different for different women. I've had a couple of athletes that didn't look really thin. They didn't look anorexic. We know that look, right? And they stopped menses because their body said, too low. And that communication went up to the hypothalamus and, turns off everything that's not critical for functioning. Immunoregulation is also really cool because there's a lot of great research going around how the fat cells encourage healthy immunity. So lots coming down the pike for that. So when the communication goes wrong, the yin yang is out of whack. The fat cells get overfed. And this is something that's really new in the 20th century, when we have the access to so much food. When our bodies were created, that wasn't really an issue, because it was, whether you believe in hunter and gatherer or you believe in, the carnivorous ancient human, either way, it took a lot of work to get food. So this phenomenon is really new. And it's mainly because of the highly refined, low nutrient foods that the liver and the pancreas can't manage. I've talked a little bit about this before. The liver does all the packaging work. So when you eat a meal, your stomach works on the digestion, your small intestine does some of it, and then it immediately goes into the liver to get packaged. So if you have a fatty liver, or if you have some kind of liver dysfunction, there's a clog in the mechanism. And so pancreas is important because it gives all the digestive enzymes. Liver is important because it's the packager of the party. Both are really important. And if they get bogged down, then the communication is affected. That's when we get the metabolic syndrome. So then we get high blood pressure and we get diabetes because the system is not working well. So really, what are the causes? I mentioned a little bit about refined foods. And I thought this picture was great. It really gives you an idea of, what does the American people eat that gets stuck in their midsection? And the part that really makes me sad is when, people say, oh, they're just kids. Let them have pizza and Big Red. And they don't realize that it's at a big cost, because even starting little, those symptoms are happening inside of our bodies. And so even just changing the food types has a very profound impact on how your body tolerates. So even if you are vacationing and you eat a lot more than you normally do, but what you're eating is pretty darn good, that's what we want to try to shoot for. Dietary fructose is a really interesting phenomenon, because in physiology, we used to be told that fructose doesn't even really need the pancreas. It gets absorbed right away. So at first glance, we might think, well, why would fructose be so bad? One, because of volume. Fructose, you've probably heard this story from me more than once, that high fructose corn syrup is in so many things that makes it bad. So too much of anything is bad. The second one is that because it doesn't require much digestion, it gets into the bloodstream right away. And when it gets into the bloodstream, the fat cells get direct action to it. I can't tell you how many people with diabetes I've been working with as of late that are such fans of fruit. They can't give it up. And they don't want to be told to eat small amounts, and so cherries are in season. I have to have 2 or 3 cups of cherries, Now, if you are not in the category of having these cytokines talking bad and having miscommunication from the monsters, you can probably manage it, because I know you're thinking, Rachel. But again, it's going to be a mix of situations that cause those fat cells to get overfed and then turn into monsters. But we know that fructose can be an issue. Sex hormones. So a little bit of this core adiposity is driven by testosterone. So you might have seen kids that are a little bit chubby right before puberty. It's the body's way of holding on to some extra energy for that growth spurt. And it's the body's way of protecting. Another situation is when a lady is pregnant. She gets extra fat around her core to prepare for something really special, taking care of that baby. So core adiposity has a purpose. And again, those fat cells definitely know how to get turned on and be activated for puberty, for having babies, for even, in some cases, protecting us from being frail elderly. But for sure, it can be overdone. And growth hormone is another really important factor, that when growth hormone is too high, why is it that kind of promotes that core, that big tummy that doesn't go away even after the growth spurt? Of course, age and gender and genetics has a big role to play. So, beer belly could certainly be from too many calories that happen to come from beer, because, and I have a son-in-law that I'm shocked. He comes to visit and he brings his own 12-pack. And and then the garbage is full of that 12-pack empty. It just blows my mind that some people can drink so much and not even really think about it. So of course, calories, whether they're coming from alcohol or pizza or donuts, is going to be treated the same. And for sure, we know that genetics can make that propensity worse for lots of reasons. But where your fat cells are distributed is something that's very hereditary. Do you know anybody that has is very thin core but has really heavy thighs, or really thin core and really big arms? That's genetics at work. Also, genetics with a little bit of environmental. So, not having core fat around your tummy is a great thing, and we can encourage that by our lifestyle. So we're going to get to that. So I thought this was a really good picture because it kind of helps us understand the buffering that goes on in functional fat tissue in a healthy cardiometabolic profile. And you might not have this one. You do? Okay, good. But what I like is that it helps you understand that when you have a healthy or a good functioning fat profile, see how they're fairly small compared to the ones on the other side where they're starting to get big? When hypertrophy as well as hyperplasia happen, hypertrophy, that's when the dysfunctional secretion starts happening. These fat cells, they get out of whack. They no longer have their control systems in place. And so elevated glucose production in the liver, the very low density lipoproteins go up. Remember what VLDLs are? If you go to the doctor and you have your cholesterol levels checked and they say, well, you've got the good fats and the bad fats. The HDLs are the good ones. Anybody remember why they're good? They're dense, which means they don't have a lot of fluff going on. They're dense, which means it's mainly protein carrier rather than the fluffy fat stuff. And we like that. Now, the very low density is the opposite. They've got all kinds of fluffy stuff and almost no protein. So they bounce around, they bang into the artery wall and cause all kinds of damage. In the pancreas here, the beta cells get killed off. Again, because they can't manage the spillover of the adipokines. So those cytokines, those bad messenger chemicals that say something bad's happening here. Okay, increased heart cell death. But on this side, look at the abdominal cavity interplay. It's got a little bit of fat there because it's evenly distributed. You've got some spillover on this side, but not on this side. The free fatty acids are buffered. Example of what that means is you go out for a really big dinner or Thanksgiving. You don't usually gain fat the next day if it's just one meal. It's buffered. It softens the edges of what you've done, right? It's not detrimental if it's one time. Now, if you bring home leftovers and you made an extra pumpkin pie to keep in the fridge just to nibble on during the week, and you make pancakes and cookies, well, that's secondary to Thanksgiving, right? It's more than just one day of eating a lot. So takeaway of this slide is where the excess goes has a really big impact on that metabolic syndrome that we are trying to avoid. So here's a really cool study. And again, all of this is coming from a great group of PubMed research articles. And again, if you want any of these, I'll be glad to share. And I left the information up on the top because this is fairly recent, a recent study that I thought was so fun. And what they did was they looked at postmenopausal women, and we're really looking at studies that affect body composition. So what really combination wise is going to help with body composition changes. So 3 years, they looked at severe to moderate energy restriction. And you're going to be amazed at the results, but I think it's so cool. So if you want to read this a little more detail, there's the information. So I know this one is small to read, but I'm going to kind of walk you through it. First of all, it was a moderately sized study, 101 participants. And they were each divided into 2 groups. One got a really severe restriction, and one got a moderate intervention. And as you go down, notice that 45 completed the really strict one, and only 31 completed the, moderate one. And just to jump ahead a little bit, the 45 showed increased inactivity. So either they were really determined, they not only ate less, they exercised more than the moderate group. So I thought that was really interesting. And as a side too, that's an area that they're studying is if you don't overeat, do you have more energy? And I think that's something that we could say, yeah. If you're eating really well and you're getting all your veggies in, you feel better. I'll never forget the time when I was working at Lifetime Fitness and I had this sweet Hispanic lady I was working with, and after maybe a month or so working with me, she came and said, Suzanne, I can't believe how good I feel after eating these days. I don't have to unbutton my pants anymore after a meal. It was just normal. You eat a Mexican meal and you either wear stretch pants or you unbutton secretly under the table, And then she said, I always had to go take a nap afterwards too, because I was, overeating. But, the good thing is once she realized how much more energy and how much better she felt not overeating, she was a new gal. And I still keep in touch with her and she looks amazing. And it was just that light bulb moment that made her realize, wow, you can feel so much better if you don't, overeat. So anyway, I just thought that was so cool. When you look at one on the really severe intervention left because of hair loss, one left because she could no longer commit, one lost a follow-up, and one just didn't like it. Well, and they were doing a liquid diet, which I would probably have a hard time with that too. And it wasn't that long. They did a period of time where they had a very restrictive intake, and then they either met their BMI, which meant that they got to 22, or they had, it wasn't healthy for them. So they were watching them very closely. If it was, looking like they were not feeling good using that very restrictive diet, they put them onto the low calorie rather than very low calorie. So 41 completed the 36-month point, and only 31 completed the moderate. And so here is more of the results. So 45 completed the whole thing, and really 41 completed the 36 months. So again, a lot more were really feeling great eating low calorie. This kind of makes me think of intermittent fasting. And we're going to talk about that in a minute too, because that's almost no calories or, completely none, very little or none for a certain period of time. And that's kind of what they did in this intervention study. So I thought it was so interesting. And so the outcome of this study was really showing that there isn't really a certain type of diet that is most successful in lowering body weight. What was most important was restricting calories and making sure protein was represented. And so that's why for our study, I want to give you 30% lower calories and 30% more protein and see how you feel, see what happens to, your waist circumference if you want to measure that, or just overall energy level. And so it'll be really fun to see where we kind of go with that. Oops, let's get rid of that one. Sorry, that's still in there. Waist, I think I've already told you this anyway. Let me see if I can take that out. No, it won't let me. Waist circumference, just as a reminder, is highly related to insulin resistance, and so it's more accurate than body mass. And the physicians groups, I think I mentioned this already, they're really pushing for getting the waist circumference as a measurement at every visit. And so again, that helps us remember what's happening with our metabolism, not just our weight. You know, stepping on a scale is such a small part of the story. And so no benefits were found with individual macro restrictions in this big study. They took out, they tried low carbohydrate, they tried low fat, they tried changing all the macros but not changing protein. And the only thing that mattered was keeping protein up to avoid some important things. So avoiding losing your muscle mass. And the too strict calorie lowering caused a problem with bone density. And so that was the other big thing with this big tempo study, is that we have to be careful that our calorie level doesn't get too low, because then we start losing really important bone mass. And so as we think about combining now, again, this tempo diet study didn't really push exercise. They encouraged it though, because they were trying to keep only one factor that they were tracking, which was calorie restriction and protein. And yet they encouraged people to exercise. And what's exciting is that just the burning of calories wasn't all that the exercise did. It helped to preserve the body mass even more. And so what the study is showing you, and I'm going to show you this a little bit more in detail next week, but just to kind of get a concept around this tempo diet study, is that when they did endurance exercise plus strength training plus high protein, we had the best results. So we had to have more protein, we had to have weightlifting and endurance to get the best overall outcome. If we did just calorie restriction, what do you think happens? We lose mass, but our BMI goes down. You see a great reduction, but again, it doesn't tell us the whole story, which could be problematic, especially for postmenopausal women. Just reducing calorie intake is not a good idea, because then you lose muscle and bone, which is what we don't want. So we go back to that curve. Remember with the BMI going, oh, that makes sense then. We get too excited about weight loss and we get our BMI all the way down to the blue zone, which, you know, the green is good, blue is, you know, below 20 BMI, and it starts to be a problem. So now we've got this wonderful metabolic process. We've got the fat mass talking, and now we've got the muscle cells talking. And that's where we want activity to really be in the center of it all. And so I just love this little lady because, you know, we studied her back at Powerhouse Bakery, and she was in her 80s at this picture, and look at that muscle in her arms. And several of those ladies that we watched or, you know, studied back in the spring, they were older. And so it's encouraging. We don't have to say, oh, well, I'm menopausal, I'm not going to try it. Or for guys, you know, it's exciting to realize that we know so much more now than we did even in the 80s, when leptin was the first hormone that we understood about fat. And now we understand so much more about it, because we're seeing that the interplay between the muscles and the fat are really where we want to play. So looking at macros, remember this: carbohydrates are the primary fuel of exercise. And so lowering, like a low carb diet, does not help in our exercise and in our overall well-being. So what do you think is going to be my next comment? The type of carbohydrates matter the most. And so we know that this new phenomenon that's been going on, you know, the last decades, of core adiposity and even little kids getting too fat, diabetes happening in kids, and of course lots in adults, and heart disease. So we know that a high carbohydrate diet isn't good the way that it's been eaten. a high carbohydrate diet can be really good depending on which ones you pick. And you've heard me talk about this, but I really believe it's so powerful. So again, in our little study in September, you can decide to still eat mainly plant-based and get your protein up. So think about this. For breakfast, what might we want to have some high protein carbs at breakfast? High protein carbs. Oatmeal. We could certainly do Ezekiel and all the sprouted grain breads. We could do lentil patties. We could quinoa. Yeah. So it's the SAD, the sad American diet, that has pushed us into eating the wrong carbs. And the worst part is that now we think carbs are what we should avoid, right? I was just working with a brand new client yesterday. She's new onset diabetes. Her A1C is really high. And she was so proud that when she went to Buc-ee's and she ordered the sandwich, she said, but I didn't eat the bread. I just ate all the meat. She said, but unfortunately it had barbecue sauce, which has sugar in it. Like, oh, she missed the boat, right? There's so much we want to teach her. If we redid her lunch and gave her the same number of calories, but we didn't say, the bread is bad and the meat's what you should be focused on. But why do you think she got that idea? Because the talk right now is keto is king, and partial keto is death, right? When you do partial keto, like she just did, all she did was eat the fat and the protein in that sandwich, and she took out the carbs. I wanted to, tell her everything right there, but I held my tongue because over the years I've learned, do not discourage your client on day one. So I just, okay, we did a good, because she was thinking, right? She was trying, and bless her heart, she's like, it's so confusing because the information out in the nutrition world is telling you high protein diet is king. Well, that's only part of the story. High protein is good, but not when it's full of fat and barbecue sauce, and even total volume will still be too much for the liver and the pancreas to manage. So portion is always king. And when I thought about this whole series, I thought, the best foods list is still a principle that I live by so seriously, because it helps us to take away all the confusion around diets out there. And it gets to focus just on what foods do you eat for protein? What carbohydrates do you eat for energy? What fats do you eat for nutrients? And whenever I talk with a new person and I try to introduce them to that, they say, oh, I don't really have any fats. I'm like, oh, yes, you do. I don't tell them that, but I think it, because they don't really add fats. Oh, I don't use mayonnaise on my sandwich, or I don't ever cook with butter. That's what they tell me because they think that's a feather in their cap. And yet, just like my little friend that was a diabetic, she thought she was doing good. But how much fat she got in that Buc-ee's sandwich, would have been shocking. And if only we could look inside her tummy and see what happened to the digestion process of that sandwich sans bread, we can imagine that her freeways were completely clogged. She was going to feel sluggish because her liver could not get all that stuff packaged and get out, right? It's sludge and stopped up. And then her energy was poor because she didn't really have any carbohydrates. And then I have another lady that is a diabetic that is vegan. And she had quite a large waist circumference, but it's gone down. And she's doing 100% carbohydrate, And so that's where I want you guys to really be equipped with knowledge around macros matter. They matter both in volume and in type. So we can get protein from vegetables, we can get carbohydrates from all kinds of things, but fructose can be risky. But anytime you pick a carbohydrate that is high in fiber and protein, that's probably going to be a green light, a good check. So thinking about what you put in your best foods list is a really powerful approach. And I still, like I said, want you to always use that in your journaling, because remember, if we think of proteins, carbs, and fats, what are the little side notes around your best foods list? Well, it's portions matter. The company that the food keeps, the cooking style, the quality of each of those foods. And so then when I get a really, smart, educated group that already get that, well, now our fat focus can be a really good one, because fats offer a slow fuel burn, and they give you all those really important nutrients that help your cardiovascular system. So let's think back on those healthy fats that help to increase your HDLs and lower your VLDLs. What would that be? Anybody want to guess? A healthy fat? Yes, avocado, extra virgin olive oil. And what are the things I always say? It's like my mantra: seeds. Seeds and nuts, because not only are they packed with fats, they're also packed with protein and even a little bit of carbohydrates. And look at the edamame, which is all of those things wrapped into one, and it can be formed into so many things. So what I propose is, this week, I want you to use that MyPlate. And any of you guys that are watching at home, I still invite you to send me this little, your journal for the first week. I want to see what your normal intake is like. And just like in the Tempo Diet research study, the first week, all they did with their subjects is say, I want you to tell me what you're eating. Now, the trick is try to be as accurate as you can with amounts. And if you can, identify where the hidden fats are. But record it. And I gave you this little handout because it's a pretty good guide. It'll tell you sort of how to measure and kind of what typical amounts are. And then when I see your numbers back, I'm going to give you a customized plan to try to follow, with 30% reduction in carbs. 30% reduction in total calories and 30% increase in protein. And so just so you know, I've been trying this the past week, and that's why I'm so aware of all the things you can do at breakfast, because I'm like, gosh, other than lentils, what else can I do? But I've been loving the wraps that are made by Food for Life. They have, good way to toast them in a skillet. You can put all kinds of things in it, even if it's just a little bit of avocado or a little bit of hummus and some greens. So experiment. But this week, try to do as much normal eating as you can as far as amounts. And that way I can give you a report back and a little plan of action to see how you can do. So when we think about protein, now this is going forward a little bit, because now I want you to be thinking about how to increase your protein after this week. Because what's so cool is, when you have a complex carbohydrate that's high in protein, now you've got an improved thermal effect, which means it takes more for your body to digest the food. So you're getting an increase in calorie burn. It helps preserve the lean body mass, which we've talked about. It's a real double whammy when a high protein food is also a grain, because it helps to improve satiety. So now think back on the sad American diet, and if you've not watching that sugar film, I want you to rewatch it. That sugar film, it's amazing. And it talks about the sad American diet, which is not really that high in carbohydrates, but the ones that he picks in his little journey in this video or movie is foods that have been touted as healthy. And so he's constantly hungry, and he is eating an enormous amount of grams of sugar. Versus protein-rich grains, you get satiated much faster. And when I used to have all these products at Powerhouse Bakery, and people would eat the muffins and go, gosh, one muffin, I'm good. It's sweet, but not too sweet. It's rich and dense, but not too dense. And you don't need to eat a bunch of them. So for 120 calories, you get a good amount of satiety. Versus the famous 100-calorie packs of Snackwell cookies. I don't know if you guys remember those, but one was never enough, and then it lived under the halo of healthy. So you're like, well, it's healthy and it's fat-free, so I think I'll have another. Because it's so intensely sweet that we are craving more. So, here's the food cocaine. And it doesn't give us satiety because it's so highly refined white flour. And then, really going to the final point of, the proteins that we pick are so important for not spiking insulin. And that really is encapsulating this whole idea around the importance of waist circumference, really understanding the metabolism that's happening inside our tummies. Because if we have insulin insensitivity, so meaning that insulin's not doing its job, now we have this cascade of events that happens with the cytokines and the fat cells, and they become monsters. We don't want them to be monsters. We want them to stay in their place, homeostasis, so that we don't start to have the cascade of events that hurts our heart and hurts our organs and ultimately gives us greater risk of morbidity and ultimately mortality. So I hope this helps, and I can't wait to see your recipes. And of course, if you want to do your tracking, you can either email it to me or just bring it next week and I'll work on it, and then we'll plan your plan from there. All right, thank you so much.